coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
I would just like to read you quickly an example of the quality of reasoning issuing out of Obama and Biden appointees on some of Trump's executive actions. So a judge ruled yesterday, I think, or maybe the day before, that Trump finally getting the ban on transgender people in the military through the executive branch. He's been wanting to do it since his first administration. A judge said, no, you can't do that. You have to allow transgender persons to serve. I just want to read you a couple footnotes and a little excerpt. So the court's, this is now quoting from the opinion, the court's opinion is long, but its premise is simple. In the self-evident truth that all people are created equal, all means all, nothing more and certainly nothing less. Footnote, after all people are created equal, women were included in the sequel, that's a quote, when passage of the 19th Amendment granted them the right to vote in 1920. See Lin-Manuel Miranda, Hamilton.
They did not.
An American Musical.
Shut up.
2016. Compare U.S. Declaration of Independence, 1776, with U.S. Constitution Amendment 1920. That right is one of the many thousands of transgender persons served to protect.
Welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind editor who killed JFK. I am joined this week by publisher and president Ryan Williams and managing editor Mike Sabo. Now, we got some interesting debate on the agenda today. I'm not sure if we are going to debate. We'll find out whether we have differing opinions on this topic, but there has been some interesting debate on the right about one of Trump's many executive orders, this one aimed directly at a particular law firm, Perkins Coie, LLP. And if you've never heard of these guys, I sympathize. I'm with you. These are guys that I've just heard of myself, and I think a lot of people are just learning, but they were in fact, at the forefront of a lot of the Russiagate stuff, the Hillary Clinton Oppo research, the Steele dossier. In particular, two of their lawyers were very directly involved with finding the sort of specious arguments and ginning up the stuff that would connect Trump tenuously to Russia, a major nuisance that dogged him throughout all of his first term. So Trump has now basically kicked these guys out of contracts with the federal government. He's banned them from federal buildings, restricted federal agencies from engaging, and looks to terminate government contracts involving the firm or its clients. So that's the top line. And the question, as always, is, can Trump do this? Is he right to do it? Should he do it? And we have sort of a variety of different opinions on the table to discuss here. This is not one of the ones, I guess, that feels as perhaps open and shut as some of the other things we've discussed, where it just seems like leftist hysteria. And none of this is really on the level of, is Trump a dictator or not? But it is about whether or not he's exceeding his powers. The major argument in the affirmative that Trump has overstepped here comes from Andy McCarthy, who wrote in National Review a lengthy piece arguing that this amounts to what's called a bill of attainder. And this is a common law concept that was very much frowned upon by the founders. In fact, it was expressly prohibited in the Constitution, is expressly prohibited in the Constitution. Bill of attainder is a measure that, rather than setting a particular standard for legality or illegality about some general class of actions, specifically identifies and condemns one person or group of people's actions, and enforces punishment upon them. So McCarthy says that's what Trump is basically doing here. He says, with these principles in mind, Trump's executive order in brazenly singling out the Perkins Coie law firm is shocking. As condemnable as bills of attainder were in British practice, at least they were parliamentary acts. Apparently, the president not only thinks that Americans can be convicted and sentenced without trial in blatant violation of the Constitution, but also that he can direct this outcome unilaterally. So the idea being essentially that Trump has both accused Perkins Coie of misdeeds and also found them guilty and issued the sentence, issued the punishment. Without any indictment, Trump pronounces that Perkins Coie has engaged in dishonest and dangerous activity that has affected this country for decades. He decrees that the firm conspired to steal an election, activity he insists is part of a pattern that includes collaborating with activist donors, including George Soros, to judicially overturn popular, necessary, and democratically enacted election laws. McCarthy, very serious thinker and writer, lays out this case in full, and maybe we'll link to each of these pieces that I'm going to just quickly run through here. The counter argument, one of two counter arguments I wanted to raise, is actually not an article, but a lengthy ex post from none other than Larry Arnn, formerly president of the Claremont Institute, now at Hillsdale. And he writes that the difference which McCarthy mentions is actually the key difference that makes this okay. That is, when McCarthy says bills of attainder used to be parliamentary acts, Arnn says, yeah, that's because bills of attainder are legislative acts. This would be a bill of attainder if Congress had simply singled out this one law firm for punitive measures. But instead, all Trump is doing is taking action that he's perfectly entitled to take. That is, changing up things within his control in response to misbehavior on the part of Perkins Coie. So Arnn writes, a bill of attainder is a bad practice of legislatures. They make judgments about particular people and impose penalties that take property or liberty. And he is right that they are forbidden in our Constitution twice. In both cases, they are forbidden to the Congress because only the Congress can commit them. What Trump has done is command the executive branch not to do business with a certain law firm. The president is fully empowered to select vendors to the executive branch. He has said members of that firm cannot go into federal buildings. The president has control of those buildings. He has said that they may not have security clearances. He has the power to grant and withhold them. He has called for the firm to be investigated for DEI, in particular that they have violated the Civil Rights Act that forbids discrimination on ground of race and sex. He may launch such investigations. If the agents of the president can make a case for these violations, they must go before an independent judge to seek penalties. So that's a portion of Arnn's response I thought was very strong. We also, just to tease a piece on the site, which you should go and read, we have a response from Carson Holloway up at AmericanMind.org, in which he makes similar arguments to Arnn plus a number of others. He says, properly understood, a bill of attainder convicts a person of a crime and then punishes him by taking away something the target of the attainder would otherwise have a right to keep. By contrast, Trump's executive order does nothing of the kind, unless McCarthy can show, which he does not even attempt to do, that Perkins Coie has a right to benefits such as security clearances and federal contracts that depend on the executive's discretion. All right, I think that's quite enough surveying of the landscape. I am not a lawyer, and so when these things come up, I always feel a little dicey, although I have a few instincts here. But I first want to hear from you guys. What do you think? Are you on a side here? Are there good arguments on both sides? Where do you fall?
Well, before we get to any of that, you mentioned JFK conspiracy theory editing, Spencer. So I ran across a joke on X, which I had not yet encountered. I'm shamelessly stealing it. I forgive the poster. I don't remember who posted it, but it was conspiracy theorist dies and goes to heaven. He's at the pearly gates. God says, you can ask me one question and I will answer. And he says, who killed JFK? And he said, Lee Harvey Oswald from the book depository. He was a soul shooter. That's what happened. And the JFK conspiracy theorist goes, this goes higher than I thought.
I liked the one that was, man, I've looked into the JFK files and it turns out his head just did that spontaneously.
No, this is our preface for saying none of us could really get that excited about the giant data dump. We'll see if anything interesting comes out of it.
But to our more conspiratorial listeners, you should be assured that we did talk about it in the chat. There was much banter about JFK in the chat.
And
so
our
there's that.
friend of the Institute, former fellow Kyle Scheidler's, one revelation about it was that it looks like the CIA knew ahead of time because they were warned by Russians that Oswald was trying to get a weapon and he was planning on killing the president. So Kyle's explanation is always the deep state, or often the intelligence community, wants to keep everything classified to hide their own incompetence rather than and make it look like they're grand masters of secrecy. That would fit very much with Angelo Codavilla's long-running indictment of the IC, claiming to be the avatars of big I intelligence, but lacking lots of small I intelligence. So
there is something a little comforting about conspiracy theories in that respect, because it would mean somebody is in charge and flying the plane, which is often not the case.
Yeah. No one's flying the plane. No one's coming to save you. You're on your own.
Oops, sorry.
Perkins Coie. Andy McCarthy makes an interesting case that this is kind of to single them out is unjust or arbitrary or kind of vindictive in a way and amounts to somehow an abuse. To which I would respond to riff on Dr. Arndt's post. One of the Perkins Coie in their court filings, one of their lawyers, or maybe in the deposition or in court, I forget where, said, this is basically a tsunami that if it breaks over the firm will drive the firm out of business. To which I would respond, live by the sword, die by the sword. Mm-hmm. I mean, if your only major client is the federal government and intelligence agencies, to base however many lawyers you employ at said firm, to basically have this business model and then to be shocked, appalled, and to claim as a matter of right that some right is being violated when it all evaporates, given the nature of the changing of the guard in the executive branch, I don't have too much sympathy for you. The other part is just the game theory part of this, which I think it's a good move by Trump on that just basic level, in the sense that I would hope that if this went through and even wiped out Perkins Coie, first of all, no one has a right to a job in this country except federal employees, it seems. So, if you're a talented lawyer, I'm sure you can get gainful employment elsewhere. Everyone gets laid off from time to time, cry me a river. But if you're going to conduct yourselves in this way, the other argument is that the two main lawyers, Mark Elias and another one, they've left the firm. And so this is an unfair indictment of all these hardworking lawyers that are still there. And it still remains the case that your firm's leadership lets you proceed in this fashion. Look, you took your shot at a sitting president, you missed, and now he's back in office. If you want to conduct yourself in this manner in a variety of ways, was political, electoral, illegitimate skullduggery in collusion with one of the major parties against the other, I should hope that a response like this would discourage such behavior in the future. And for that reason, it will be conducive to civic health rather than civic corruption. So the bigger picture, I think, is more important than Andy's quibbling. I will just add, the last quote from Larry Arndt's tweet on this was wonderful. It's very Arkansan. Larry's from Arkansas, and it's a sort of Larry idiom of sorts. He said, the president has called the firm a dirty dog. If they think they've been slandered, they know the way to the courthouse, just as they've caused so much trouble in going to the courthouse to harass him in the past. So sauce for the goose is good for the gander here. And we'll see. I mean, we'll see what the courts make of this or in this particular instance, but I don't see any egregious violation of rights here. Now, the one last aspect of this that some of our more sort of parsimonious proceduralists on the right, Andy and others, he didn't raise this argument, I don't think, but it looks like blatant viewpoint discrimination. And I would say that the circumstances of it, that is, as laid out by Larry Arndt, are a more compelling case that it's just a matter of executive discretion. And they're, in fact, not singling them out for mere speech, but rather for corrupt and abusive conduct. So,
yeah. And I should note, one thing I didn't say is there is currently a TRO, a temporary restraining order, on parts of this executive order. So yeah, it'll make its way through the courts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think just like everything else today, I mean, it seems like judges are kind of holding up things right and left. I just read something. I think Eric Tietzel, who's a Lincoln Fellow, just in 2024, he just said 67% of all injunctions this century came against President Donald Trump in his first term. 92% were imposed by Democratic appointed judges. This does not include the 15 injunctions imposed by district courts in February. That just in February, that was more than Biden's entire presidency, 4 years. So I think this kind of hits to that problem too, which we'll talk about, I think, in another segment.
See, Trump is just getting more done than Biden ever did.
Exactly.
His record of
the judges just can't take the power and the energy. Like the vibe shift is just too much for them. So they must stop it. At least
we should say, Mike, too, that Eric Tietzel was citing Claremont Institute Publius alum, so Lincoln alum Eric Tietzel citing Publius alum Ben Weingarten's long piece, which I encourage everyone to check out at Real Clear Investigations, about these stats about courts meddling with the president. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem. And that's a great piece too. I got a chance to read that, and Ben did outstanding work as usual. So I would highly encourage you to read that too if you haven't done that already. But just going back to this executive order, part of me, reading McCarthy, I mean, I wanted to read him fairly and everything, and I thought he brought up some good points, but to me, there just seems to be a lack of overall understanding about the big picture. I mean, it's like you're looking minutely at the law. Okay, I can understand that. Former prosecutor prosecuted the blind sheikh, I think, in first World Trade Center bombing in, I think it was 1993. So I get that, but it just, I don't know. I just feel like he misses just the larger point of what has happened to Trump. And he even brings that up in the article. So I will give him that. Another actually positive thing, even though he said he disagrees with, John Eastman and the 2020 election and all that, he still supports him, calls him a friend. So I will give him that too. That I think still takes some courage to say that in print, even on the right. So I do really appreciate that. But I think
and McCarthy has been, this is not like, actually, I will interject here just to say that I sort of scrolled through some of the replies to McCarthy's tweet in which he posted this piece. And I have to say, I find true Never Trump, like Lincoln Project level Never Trump, just as odious as anyone else. But this thing where somebody makes a principled argument with due concession, there's lots of concession in this piece to the other side.
Mhm.
And then the response is like, what does your wife's boyfriend think about that? I mean, come on, man. This is getting completely out of hand. But I guess it's X. So what are you going to do?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's X. They're grifters. They're all kind of bad actors. And yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff is really dumb. Look, I mean, McCarthy wrote a whole book, Ball of Collusion, about Russiagate, exposing it. So yeah, I mean, that does not apply in this case. You can agree, disagree. I probably, especially after reading Dr. Arn's tweets and then reading Carson's piece that he did for us, I think they bring up some interesting points, really the definition of what ability of attainder is. Look, Perkins Coie doesn't have a right to our national security. They don't have a right to these things. Like what's been said before, President Trump is not attacking them because they attacked him over and over again. It's just, look, this firm has done damage to the United States, and these things are not their right. They make a good case. It'll be interesting to see. I'm not sure actually if Andy's actually had time to reply at NRO. I'll actually have to go look there later. It's a really interesting back and forth, and it does show ever since kind of Trump came on the scene, a kind of vitality on the right. And this is very much, I think, unlike the left, where we're interested in big questions, principled questions. What does the Constitution have to say about this, that, and the other? That I think the left is just still just in utter lockstep. The doubling down on DEI, social justice, everything since the election. It's been amazing just watching like videos of Tim Walz. I mean, talking about, oh my gosh, Republicans are scared of my masculinity. It's like, dude, you just got absolutely crushed in the 2024 election. Like, you have no room to talk about any of this stuff. So that is the biggest takeaway, I think, for me, is that we are interested in these things when we take these things seriously in a way that the left doesn't, because they don't believe in any of it. I mean, history is constantly pulling us forward. People, when I've noticed the Alien Act, and we'll talk about this later, when that's being reported on, let's say the Alien Act of 1789, as if that date somehow just, well, obviously it's wrong. It's 2024. Why is Trump bringing up something that came out in 1789? And it's just this like silly, insipid kind of historicism that just like permeates everything.
Yeah, it's a medieval archaism, this 18th century law. Right, like the Constitution?
Right, exactly. Like the 1787 Constitution that you say Trump is shredding.
But to your point, Mike, Andy, come on the pod, like respond in TAM if you want. I mean, I guess he'll probably respond in National Review, but
right.
I mean, yeah,
right.
I look forward to reading what McCarthy has to say about this. I think the point about the seriousness of this dispute on the right is really important. It's one thing to get into an argument over what the legitimate enumerated powers are of the three branches. It's But at least that assumes that there are three branches with enumerated powers, which ought to be observed and kept hermetically sealed from one another, and so on and so forth. On the left, it feels like people are just acting as if the executive has to just take whatever sort of the bureaucratic state forces down its throat. And that this to me was the deciding factor on the EO, actually, about Perkins Coie. Again, not a lawyer, and so interested to read what everybody has to say, but I'm actually less on the fence about this one than I am about our next topic on the subject of judges and Venezuelan gang members, which we'll get into in a moment. On this one, I read the whole McCarthy piece, and I just kept thinking, but isn't this just a like an at-will employment relationship, essentially, that he's terminating for stated reasons? I mean, I know it's a little bit more complicated than that, but I would liken it in some ways to the Claremont Institute. Now, this is going to be a really inexact analogy, and
That's
nobody
our bread and
at the
butter on this
IRS.
show.
That's right. Yeah, that's my favorite. What better kind of analogy is there? We don't traffic in exact analogies here. No, I mean, nobody should take this to say that Claremont's a political entity, because we're not. We're a think tank and a commentary shop. But we do, I mean, all think tanks, left and right, exist to advise and shape policy. And when the administration in power aligns with a think tank's views, alumni of that think tank, people previously associated with that think tank, end up closer to the centers of power. We've got people now in the Trump years that are involved in DC in a way that we didn't in the Biden years, and we take that on board as simply a feature of operations. That's just part of the terrain. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, sometimes you're in with the guys in power, sometimes you're out with the guys in power. I actually really fail to see how the Perkins Coie situation is all that different. Like, you are a law firm that primarily contracts with the federal government. It stands to reason that the person in charge of the federal government is going to have an effect on what kind of business you can and can't get. So maybe that's too simplistic. Maybe I'm being a bit of a dolt, but it just seems like where is there a right? And this is I guess what Carson Holloway was saying. Where is there a right for these lawyers to get federal contracts from an administration whose main principal character they've spent years defaming in the most grotesque possible ways? It just doesn't seem all that.
Also, this has been in the news lately too, and here's another inexact comparison. But you've had what seems to be quite a few fly-by-night NGOs and nonprofits, quote unquote nonprofits, that were stood up at the very end of the Biden administration to collect billions of dollars that went out the door before Trump came into power. The left does this all the time. It's rankly corrupt. Stacey
Right.
Abrams defends the $2 billion that her affiliated brand new NGO got because it doesn't even matter. I mean, it was her justification for the amount of money and that they were actually doing good work was tenuous, to say the least. But, think tanks on the right, us included, have always considered government money to be very, very dangerous. Way back,
Yeah.
way back in our first decade, we had some money from the National Endowment for the Humanities to do some like teacher training stuff. And some random senator thought we were bad and right wing and nudged the IRS to open an investigation into us. This is now in Claremont lore. It was well before my time, but I've been warned about this sort of thing institutionally. And basically the feds, crawled up our proverbial document, for 6 months, parked two people at the office, everything ground to a halt while they sifted through every piece of paper in the building. So, I mean, this is, if the left is getting a little taste of this now because they got a little over their skis on their partisanship masquerading as federal contracting, here's the world's smallest violin. I don't really care.
Yeah. Speaking of Larry Arnn, right? I mean, this is why Hillsdale doesn't take government money. One of the reasons why Hillsdale doesn't take government money as well is because it comes with strings attached. Okay. Let's look at, actually, to me, the slightly more ambiguous and tangled case, although you guys can tell me why it's completely straightforward, if you like. Trump has used another 18th century law. We should have some sort of organ music to go along with this, a la the Spanish Inquisition. The Alien Enemies Act of 1798. Invoking this act, the Trump administration has deported a number of Venezuelan migrants who the administration says are members of Tren de Aragua, a pretty nasty Venezuelan gang. And in response to this, pretty quickly, the ACLU and Democracy Forward sued in a DC district court over due process violation. That essentially, if these are in fact gang members, the Trump administration needs to show that in order to satisfy the conditions of the law. So technically, their argument is not based on the archaism of the law, although there is some question whether the law requires us to be in a state of war. I was actually just watching a press conference in which some reporters were asking, are we going to declare war on Tren de Aragua in order to sort of satisfy these conditions? The answer from the Trump camp was no, the law is broader than that and allows us to deal with a persistent invasion or something along those lines. And so that's the Trump position. The ACLU position is, well, if that's the case, you need to show it. In the verbal court argument, the judge verbally demanded that the flights with these migrants on them be turned around. This was not in the written court order. And so the Trump team's perspective is, sorry, too late. They're already in the air. We can't just bump them back like some kind of volleyball across the sea to bring them back. And basically, too late, too bad, so sad. So there is naturally a great hue and cry over constitutional crises, et cetera, that this is supposed to be somehow Trump dictatorially, unilaterally asserting power and depriving first the immigrants, then soon the citizens of their due process rights. This seems, as usual, overblown to me for reasons we kind of got into last time when we were talking about Mahmoud Khalil, that it's not as if there's some sort of sliding scale of citizenry to which constitutional rights attach and are protected by citizenship. That's the whole point. And so the fact that people have been treating green card holders and indeed illegal immigrants as if they had all the privileges of citizenship is itself kind of telling about the absolute state of the discourse on this subject. All of that having been said, it does seem to me like there are some legitimate questions here about how the law is to be interpreted, about what are the requirements for demonstrating that a given individual satisfies the conditions for deportation under the law. And it does seem like the courts, unfortunately, are the right place to raise those issues. I say unfortunately because many of these district courts, such as, for instance, the DC one, are manifestly hostile to Trump. But then I think, well, in that case, what we should want is some sort of set of Supreme Court decisions about this stuff. And I've been thinking for a while that maybe the Trump team actually wants ultimately to provoke those very Supreme Court disputes. And so ultimately, I guess we're just on a course here that we already were on to kind of arguing these things out in the Supreme Court. But you guys, help me untangle this. What's the right response here? And what does Trump want? What should Trump want?
It's sort of a question of venue, jurisdiction, and the separation of powers all rolled into one. So the government's reply brief, Margot Cleveland's been covering this a lot on Twitter, so you can find most of it on her posts over the last 3 days. But, I mean, this particular case, I think, is disposed of pretty easily. That court just really doesn't have jurisdiction over this question. It's also quite fishy that this motley crew of alleged Venezuelan gang members got very competent counsel within, 30 minutes of or 2 hours. And the council, unfortunately, filed in the wrong, not where they were being held before they were flown out. So they really don't have jurisdiction. And, if it seems fairly adequately covered under the Enemy Aliens Act. And so the proper remedy for this is Congress to repeal that act, to otherwise, if they want to, threaten the executive with withholding of funding and other stuff in order to force them to stop this abusive practice if the Congress thought it was abusive. I mean, just the court remedies for this sort of activity, especially as it falls into this area where the commander-in-chief has quite a bit of leeway, both historically and as a matter of statute and as a matter of long practice. It just seems that a federal district court or even the DC circuit is not a place where this sort of thing can be adequately addressed. And unfortunately, in our modern way of doing government, we really only think of the courts to address this sort of question. And it's a testament to the atrophied state of our separation of powers, where Congress thinks the remedy for this and all sorts of other things is in court, rather in, so to speak, their court, that is, the Congress, laws, power of the purse, and all the rest. But we don't really think about any of this that way anymore. I should also say that their ultimate remedy, and both parties think this way, given the unpleasantness and the conduct of legislatures in this hyper-partisan time, they could impeach the president if they think it's really abusive. That's always a remedy. They can't vote him out of office again because he's term limited. Old shout out to maybe the wisdom of no term limits for the presidency in the original Constitution, but that ship sailed long ago. So it's just, I think it's very hard for normal Americans, or even especially the elite DC class, lawyer heavy as it is, to think about this in any other way than this. Some court has to resolve this. And I would suggest that's the wrong way to think about it.
It's kind of amazing just reading, even it's DC, so you expect this. I'll just read this line from a Politico article. President Donald Trump on Tuesday called for the impeachment of the federal judge who ordered a 2-week halt to his efforts to, quote, remove Venezuelan migrants. So that's their term, euphemism for an actual terrorist organization that's killing, murdering people, etc. And then I'll go on, using extraordinary war powers that haven't been invoked in decades. So so you understand, how the well is just tainted right off the bat. You read, I think might be the beginning, maybe in the first sentence of the Alien Enemies Act of 1789. Whenever there is a declared war, so it's only declared war. Oh, actually, between the United States and any foreign nation or government, or any invasion or predatory incursion is perpetuated, attempted, or threatened against the territory of the United States by any foreign nation or government. Okay, well, but this group, are they actually tied to the government? Well, actually, yeah, there's actually a good case to be made that they are essentially like the narco-terrorist arm of the Venezuelan government and the Maduro regime and what's going on there. Cynical Publius made actually, I think, a really good case for this on Twitter, that's true. And so, to me, it's about, timing. Okay, where was the plane? Should, Stephen Miller, the press kind of brought that to him. Should the plane have been turned around? The judge is angry about that it wasn't. You have Nayib Bukele, kind of getting in on the Trump side of things too, kind of egging on the press on X about that. So it really is an interesting, and what we're going to see, I think, is really Article 2 versus Article 3. Who's going to win out? We've been kind of under this judicial kind of supremacy regime for, I think, quite a long time now, really ever since the 1950s, possibly before that, which I would argue is different in kind than what Chief Justice Marshall set down in Marbury v. Madison in 1803. That was just basically a judicial review. That's nothing new. Even Hamilton talked about that. He didn't use that term. And actually, Marshall doesn't use that term either. A judicial province actually is the term I think Marshall uses. But that was just a common law, basically definition of what the courts do. That's just what they do. They look at the statutes in front of them and interpret them and find out, okay, and then they look at and they weigh, okay, which overrules the other, especially in a country like ours. So I think that's where this is going to, is really kind of a constitutional battle. Are we ruled by judges who can basically put in nationwide injunctions, or does Congress rule in the legislature? Does the executive rule in the executive branch? Does the judiciary do what they're supposed to do, but in their branch? I don't think they're not supposed to be, the final arbiters of the Constitution that set basically everything in place that the other two branches need to follow, not only in that specific case, that's a different question, but in every case and everything that's like that. That is a completely different thing. And so I think you see Andrew Jackson, you see Abraham Lincoln. I think there's a good tradition of presidents, of the founders, who've pushed back against that. With Madison's theory of departmentalism, where, each branch has the duty to understand the Constitution and enforce it as they do. So these are really kind of regime questions. These are profound questions. And we'll see how the Trump administration handles it. I hope that they handle it well, because it really does have huge implications for, are we ruled by 9 justices or hundreds of federal court justices, or actually by the people themselves?
I just wanted to flag really quickly for those interested. Mike mentioned the 50s. So at 1954, of course, is Brown v. Board of Education. And in some of the hangover cases of Brown v. Board, the southern states were dragging their feet in desegregating the public schools. And it ultimately showed the lack of enforcement mechanism available to the Supreme Court. So in a case in 1958, Cooper versus Aaron, they cited John Marshall and Marbury and said, Marshall said it's the province and duty of the court to say what the law is. He said when you have a constitution, which is the supreme law alongside other laws, in a case before the court, they obviously have to side with the supreme law. So the Constitution is supreme, and we're here interpreting it in this case. What Cooper versus Aaron did was say, Marshall said the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. Therefore, our interpretation of the Constitution is supreme. That was the sleight of hand that was given a certain moral weight because of the issue at hand, which was desegregation. Anyway, that's the potted history of how we got to where we are. And it's another way in which the slavery question and its hangover into Jim Crow and the civil rights movement has distorted a lot of other parts of our system, with judicial supremacy being one of the major pieces of it.
So one thing that the left has decided is that this Supreme Court, which features many Trump appointees, is basically, if not illegitimate, then toying at the edge of forfeiting its legitimacy by accruing to itself all sorts of activist powers. This is laughable for a number of reasons, especially since that is kind of a classic right-wing concern about activist judges, but also most interestingly to me, because in fact, a lot of the signature decisions that have come down from this court have shown a remarkable willingness to limit judicial power. I'm thinking especially of Dobbs, which is about basically disavowing the court's right to make a decision about a nationwide decision about abortion. I still think it's probably a stretch to think that they might dig as deeply, Ryan, as you just did, and kind of overturn just the whole theory of the court in the 21st century. It's so, what you're talking about is so deep cut, so niche, so deeply ingrained that it kind of ranks among it strikes me as one of those like big Claremont wish list items, which you never know, right? Like in time, these things do come to pass. And it's possible. I guess I'm just very interested to know what the Supreme Court is going to do about all of these challenges, which really haven't made their way down the pipeline yet. Can you explain, Ryan, what this has to do, if this is the same issue as the FTC firings that have been making a splash?
Yeah.
Is that related?
Yeah. So the story of the last few weeks is courts meddling with executive authority. That's how the administration is pitching it. And interestingly, Trump just removed 2 Federal Trade Commission officers. They're both claiming illegally, and they're suing about it. The FTC is one of these independent government agencies where their members serve for fixed terms. They're usually they're staggered appointments over time. So usually presidents of both parties get to appoint people as the terms come up. I believe there are 7-year terms on the FTC, but don't quote me. Now, this is an interesting case because the Trump administration wants to force a revisiting of this old case from 1935, Humphrey's Executor, which had to do with an FTC member. FDR wanted to remove a member of the FTC because he wanted one of his people in to be more aligned with government policy. The FTC was fairly new in 1935, just a few years old, I think, maybe a little older than that. Doesn't really matter. The case goes up. Humphrey's Executor, it's Humphrey's widow, because Humphrey had died, and she's basically suing for the remainder of his pay, because she argued he wasn't removable. The precedent before that was a 1926 case called Myers v. United States. Woodrow Wilson wanted to remove a postmaster who I think was from Oregon. He might have been from Washington. I think it was Oregon. Anyway, the old spoils system in the United States, starting maybe most dramatically with the Jackson administration, worked. You had 40 to 60% turnover in the federal civil service when you had a new president, especially of another party. Now, the federal government was much smaller back then, but it was still a big deal, and you kind of got your people in. Now, Pendleton Act in the 1880s wanted to fix this, partly as a backlash over Andrew Johnson's perceived abuses after the death of Abraham Lincoln and his fight with the Congress and the Reconstruction Congress. Anyway, long story short, Congress sought to protect a big class of federal civil servants and to condition their removal on consent of the Senate. That's what was at issue in Myers v. U.S. And the court, led by Chief Justice William Howard Taft, a former president himself, the only man to hold two offices, he sort of goes for 100 pages and goes back to Madison and the first fight over the Secretary of the Treasury and whether he was removable by the president alone or whether his removal could be conditioned by the Senate, because the Senate, of course, advises and consents to appointments, but there's no talk of removal. Anyway, Madison's argument was you have to have a president who can remove his officers, otherwise you can't have accountability in the executive branch. That's sort of the question, the heart of the question, which we still wrestle with today. The court in 1935, that is 9 years after Myers v. U.S., basically reversed itself and said, well, yeah, it's true. Madison's right about accountability and Myers v. U.S. is right too. But these are weird animals, these independent agencies. If they exercise or if officers exercise quasi-judicial or quasi-legislative power, and as opposed to purely executive power, then Congress can condition their removal. And that is really the jurisprudential ruling that built the entire independent modern administrative state. So I think it's very telling that the Trump administration decided to pick a fight with the FTC, as that case, considering that agency, is the OG precedent for the fourth branch of government as we find it today. Now, the Roberts Court has chipped away at this a little bit with a few opinions over the last 15 years, reasserting a little bit of the president's authority to control the officers in the executive branch, even officers in independent agencies, most famously with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And so this is really their test case. They want Humphrey's executor overturned. I think it would be good for constitutional government if it were overturned. I would just like to read you quickly an example of the quality of reasoning issuing out of Obama and Biden appointees on some of Trump's executive actions. So a judge ruled yesterday, I think, or maybe the day before, that Trump finally getting the ban on transgender people in the military through the executive branch. He's been wanting to do it since his first administration. A judge said, no, you can't do that. You have to allow transgender persons to serve. I just want to read you a couple footnotes and a little excerpt. So the court's, this is now quoting from the opinion, the court's opinion is long, but its premise is simple. In the self-evident truth that all people are created equal, all means all, nothing more and certainly nothing less. Footnote, after all people are created equal, women were included in the sequel, that's a quote, when passage of the 19th Amendment granted them the right to vote in 1920. See Lin-Manuel Miranda, Hamilton.
They did not.
An American Musical.
Shut up.
2016. Compare U.S. Declaration of Independence, 1776, with U.S. Constitution Amendment 1920. That right is one of the many that thousands of transgender persons serve to protect. And then I just want to read two more paragraphs because it gets to this question of government expertise, of outside think tanks and their legitimization of expertise and their ability to opine on policy. So before 2014, the United States precluded transgender persons from military service. This changed during President Barack Obama's second term. In 2014, the Department of Defense eliminated its categorical ban on service by transgender persons, an issue, I might add, that probably hadn't only been an issue for 5 to 7 years at that point at all, and on anyone's radar, and instructed each branch of the armed forces to reassess the ban's rationales. In 2015, then Secretary of Defense Ashton B. Carter established a working group to identify issues related to open military service by transgender persons. To aid its work, the group commissioned the RAND Corporation's National Defense Research Institute to study this issue. After a year of research, RAND concluded that allowing transgender persons to serve openly would have minimal impact on unit cohesion and estimated the impact of transgender persons serving openly on readiness to be negligible. It further found that extending healthcare coverage for gender transition-related treatments represented an exceedingly small portion of healthcare expenditures. Anyway, the footnote for RAND is great. The National Defense Research Institute is not a fly-by-night operation. It is a, quote, federally funded research and development center sponsored by the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Staff, the Unified Combatant Commands, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the defense agencies, and the defense intelligence community. So the spirit of all this is, look, an expert group, which does lots of serious business with serious parts of the government, said this is not a big deal. Case closed. It's a matter of equal protection. You can't ban it. As if the Rand Corporation, which is entire existence is reliant completely on government contracts and government commissioned research, is going to tell the sitting administration, which is clearly committed to this change in policy, that, oh, actually, we studied it and it would be terrible for unit cohesion, and it's ridiculous and you can't do it. I mean, the whole thing is laughable. It shows this symbiotic relationship between quote unquote expert outside think tanks and all the rest, and inside government and the relation to policy. And so, anyway, I just the citation to Hamilton, a musical, is the most absurd thing I've seen in a court opinion ever. And it should be laughed out of court and out of legitimacy. And so the big question is, what's the Trump administration going to do about all this? I think they've been fairly restrained, at least in their official responses to this sort of thing. I think they're hoping that the Roberts Court is working itself up to a test case that they really like, where they can tell district courts to quit it with universal injunctions and to try to restore some sanity to this sort of thing. I mean, the idea that the commander in chief, as he's changed offices, can't reverse a policy that's all of 15, not even 15 years old, on one of the more controversial, if not the most controversial culture war issue in a century or ever. The whole thing, just to normal Americans, if you explain any of this to them, they would be baffled at why this is somehow a matter of sacrosanct judicial proceedings rather than the normal give and take of partisan elections and the changing of the guard with a new administration.
I have to be completely honest with you, Ryan. After you said the words women in the sequel, I completely lost all higher reasoning functions and capacity to process complex strings of verbal information. I'm just completely stunned that that exists. That is some in this house we believe reasoning in an honest to goodness court document, and I'm honestly here for it. To be fair, accelerationism, baby. Like, just heighten the contradictions, maximize the absurdity, and maybe at some point we figure out that this is all preposterous. And I will say that as a fan of Hamilton, I don't think I've ever come out on this podcast as somebody who actually likes that musical and knows most of the lyrics to the part that was quoted in that footnote. But you know what I'm not doing? Writing judicial opinions. This is like if they quote, it's like quoting Emma Lazarus, the poem from the Statue of Liberty, as part of the Constitution. Really hilarious. Okay, maybe I will recommend Hamilton and make my case for it in our recommendations section, so that everybody can throw tomatoes at me. But
I will. Yeah. I just flag for people an oldie but goodie from our own Richard Samuelson, longtime friend of
yes,
of Claremont, who does not like Hamilton. He may like the music and loved sitting and watching it, but Hamilton versus History, summer 2016, an essay for the Claremont Review Books at the time, just the online version of CRB, where Richard's quibble with Hamilton the musical is that it makes Hamilton into a capital P progressive. And so it's a subversive piece of cultural art, and he don't like it.
Yes, that is the best case against it, is that it misrepresents Hamilton's actual views, and Richard's piece is really good. I guess the dispute over Hamilton that has since unfolded is somewhat different, not about what did Hamilton believe or not believe, and more about the racial politics of the show and whether they're progressive or secretly crypto conservative. So the progressive argument would be, why does everybody have to be black and brown? Why can't we just like our founders for who they were? That is to say, Anglos, and why is it that we need to cast this mixed race United Colors of Benetton version of the history? Why do we have to put it in hip hop, and so on and so forth? The counter argument being, actually, the premise of casting these people as like other races, the American premise that America belongs, despite the fact that these people's heritage is not directly connected to the founding belongs to them and is for them, and this is part of their history as well. And I would just point in that debate as a deciding factor the fact that when the summer of Floyd happened, Hamilton suddenly got canceled because previously it had been a good progressive idea that Black, brown, and white and Asian people could all participate in the founding. Afterward, if you were listening to like Slate podcasts, they were like, wait, but actually the founders are evil racists. So don't we kind of hate Hamilton for suggesting that we should lionize them? And so the fact that the left doesn't like Hamilton for being too positive about the founders, plus the fact that it's something that Lin-Manuel Miranda actually did before he sucked. So there are two musicals, Hamilton and In the Heights, are both actually well written. And if you listen to the lyrics, they're genuinely fresh and good. He was a disciple of the line of descent that kind of begins with Gilbert and Sullivan, goes down through Rodgers and Hammerstein on to Stephen Sondheim, and then sort of with a weird little detour for the guy that did Rent, Andrew Larson, but then back to Lin-Manuel. And he was at the time a worthy successor to that. And then Disney got their paws on him and he completely fell apart. And also he's a turbo lip. So there's no question about the guy himself being currently insufferable. He's in everything. Everything he's in now sucks. There was a time when Lin-Manuel was good, and Hamilton is him at his peak powers, lyrically speaking. So this is my case for conservatives embracing.
I understand. Our longtime student of and practitioner of theater, our chairman, Tom Klingenstein, his complaint about Hamilton is that it wasn't really even theater, not musical theater. It's just because there's no story. It's just a bunch of sketches. But that is a very deep cut criticism of Hamilton.
That is interesting. Well, in that case, though, isn't it sort of a libretto? I mean, there's like a, well, anyway, not to argue. Tom and I can have this conversation off channel. In any case,
shut this theater kid argument down.
Shut this theater kid. Shut this theater nerd discussion down. I guess we probably don't have time to really go deep into these two other news items that I will just mention to do with war and the world stage. One of them is that Trump is hitting back at the Houthis. Finally, these are these like Yemeni pirates that the Iranian government basically commissions to make life difficult for all good and righteous people. They've been interfering with global trade routes and making serious inconveniences, adding enormous amounts of time and cost and difficulty to shipping. So people have to go, instead of going via the Red Sea, people have to go around like the Cape of Good Hope, have to reroute around Africa. Biden let this happen because he was afraid of escalation. Trump is now putting his foot down and launching all these strikes against them. The other big news on the global front right now is that Trump and Putin had a call in which Putin, or rather, I should say, Trump expressed his desire once again to get to a lasting peace. Putin did not go all the way to where Trump would have liked, which is to say to a ceasefire, but it does look like there's going to be a temporary and partial ceasefire on energy production and a few other targets with an aim toward, and a hostage exchange as well, with an aim toward a lasting ceasefire. Ukraine is also on board with this. The big issue is that Russia seems to want America to cease weapons aid to Ukraine. And Ukraine is worried that if we do that, Russia will simply rebuild and then violate the ceasefire, which it's been known to do in the past. So fair enough to just leave that there because we'll probably have to come back to it later on anyway, since those are both developing stories. But just going to mention that. And then if you guys have anything to say about it, please do. Also, if you have anything to recommend this week besides Hamilton, which is available for streaming on Disney Plus. Let me know.
I just want to. So Bannon said the other day, I forget in what venue, that the U.S. is under no obligation to keep open the Straits of Hormuz, basically. To which my response was, fair enough, I suppose. And Bannon and the American conservative crowd are worried about an escalating war with Iran. I think they're wrong about that. Well, maybe, I mean, it's a completely valid worry, maybe, but it seems like a classic prudent exercise of American power and very much in our interest to keep the Straits of Hormuz open for shipping for all the reasons you said, Spencer. I mean, it will redound, among other things, to cheaper shipping costs for a lot of goods that we import over here. The ships don't have to go, as you said, all the way around Africa. So I don't understand the objections here, really. And piracy, classic. I mean, going back to the very beginning of the Republic, piracy is like the president's unilateral bread and butter.
Who had Barbary pirates on their roundtable bingo card for
Barbary
2025? We
pirates
made it. It happened.
and the Marine Corps from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, which Mike I think mentioned last week. I mean, it's like deep American lore that we summarily execute pirates. So just because they have a state sponsor that is likes to saber rattle, I don't know. It seems like an overdue response, as you said, Spencer, to this pesky problem in the Red Sea.
And I'll just make one quick comment just on the the peace process that looks like is happening. Obviously, Ukraine's on board. I think Trump is probably going to have to do a little bit more to get Putin on board, but I think that'll happen. I mean, think about the whole Oval Office blow up with Zelensky. What was that? Almost 3 weeks ago. Trump's going to start World War III. That this guy is a madman. Look at then what's happened. Peace. I mean, he's getting guys to the table. This looks like this is going to happen. He's trying to draw down an end to a war that, for various reasons, historically, obviously you have so much history between Ukraine and Russia, but that, shouldn't have happened for various reasons. The West, I think, kind of trying to egg it on as much as we could with color revolutions, especially in 2014. And, Trump is the guy who looks like is going to get it done, obviously with the help of the Saudis, too. And it's just another string. I mean, it just seems like this happens over and over and over again. The media has some completely different take that now in retrospect, I mean, I think it was wrong at the time. Now it's like shown completely wrong. And yet they just go on and act like it hasn't happened and that they aren't batting like 0.07. I mean, that's incredible to me, that just the gall from these people to just keep going. Like, oh yeah, we still, are owed respect. And it's like, you've just gotten thing wrong after wrong after wrong. I mean, it's quite amazing. So that's what I'll say, praying definitely for a conclusion of this war. And yeah, it's great to see.
Terrific. Either of you guys want to toss a recommendation at our listeners?
I will. I will recommend everyone read Vanity Fair's heyday at the Yale Review. Brian Burrow, a long-form reporter for Vanity Fair under the leadership and editorship of Graydon Carter, who was editor from 92 to 2017. It's a fun, gossipy piece. It's a little self-indulgent by the author, but it gives you a sense of the kind of heyday of fairly recent high-end print journalism. And the really shocking paragraph that made its way around Twitter was Brian Burrow's reporting that at the height of his pay, which was in the mid 90s, he was getting paid $498,000 a year to write 3 10,000-word investigative pieces, which took him about 6 months out of his year. And he admits this is obscene, but he was grinning all the way to the bank, and he only reports it now because he felt it's his duty. And yes, he realizes it's ridiculous. But the quick fall of high-end glossy print journalism and sort of print in general with the onset of the internet, it really captures how big of a fall that's been, and explains a lot of the schizophrenia and the panic for a certain part of the laptop class and its fall in the last couple decades.
So I'll plug a show that I've plugged in the past, and I actually just finished watching it for the second time, Wolf Hall, which came out, I think, originally in 2015. Just great, back and forth showing everything going on between Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII, the breakup of Britain's exiting the Roman Catholic Church and under the Pope's jurisdiction, and it's a wonderful job, great acting, and unbeknownst to me, actually, when I started, a new season actually is going to be out here in America, I think, very shortly. I think even maybe the end of this week, maybe the beginning of next week. Same main actors, Damian Lewis, Mark Rylance, who again did a fantastic job in the first one. So I'm expecting great things for season 2.
Okay, I love Wolf Hall also, and the novels are great. But if you're going to ding me on historical inaccuracies for Hamilton, they did my boy Thomas More so dirty in the show and the web series. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and I finished Dune Prophecy, which is only 6 episodes in this first season, and I enjoyed it. It held up. I mean, it's got its problems, but I think fans of Dune will probably find it interesting. Now, diehard fans of the books, which I don't know how you can be given the sort of devolution of the books as they multiplied, may think it's just too out of left field. But it's like Game of Thrones meets the beginning of the Bene Gesserit, and there's plenty of death and a couple plot twists, and there's some AI critiques thrown in there too. So I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to finishing that show. I kind of let it drop, but it sounds good. And I guess I have to do something besides Hamilton just to save face with our listeners, who I'm sure I've lost all credibility with them already anyway. But I will just say, I'm watching your mention of the Bene Gesserit. Ryan puts me in mind of that classic sci-fi plot device where somebody has the power to just like tell you to do something and you instantly do it. That's their mate. They have the voice, which makes you do stuff. And there's an episode like that in the absolute banger of a 90s episodic TV show, Supernatural, about two brothers who go around fighting demons, and kind of one of them is like the nerd who's always looking up the lore of around the werewolves and the different, they come up every week, they come up with some new crazy sort of urban legend or story, and then they put it into the modern context, and it sounds really hokey, and it is kind of hokey at some level, but it also really holds up at sort of like before peak TV, when TV was just kind of good and solid and entertaining. And there's tons of episodes of it if you decide to get into Supernatural, all streaming on Netflix.
One last deep cut. I don't know why it came to my mind, but I really enjoyed a couple years ago. Maybe I've brought it up on the podcast. I'm not sure. But for science fiction fans in novel form, this somewhat obscure writer, although fans of this stuff will probably immediately say he wasn't obscure, he's a classic. Werner Vinge, very weird name, with his 1992 book A Fire Upon the Deep, which is about a sort of futuristic Earth and the rise of technology and space travel, and kind of it's all wrapped up in unmoved movers and all sorts of stuff. Anyway, if you like sci-fi, it's a modern classic and not that well known. And then his sequel, which was interesting, especially if you like the first one, although not as awesome, but also pretty good, A Deepness in the Sky from 1999. He won a Hugo Award for both those novels. Anyway, I liked him. If you're into that sort of thing, check him out.
I definitely am. I just hit order now on Amazon. That will be my week. I have a weekend novel that I use to decompress from the nonfiction that I read during the week. So that will be my next one. And with that, that really is all the time we have. So all that's left for me to say is I am Usnavi, and you probably never heard my name. Reports of my fame are greatly exaggerated, exacerbated by the fact that my syntax is highly complicated because I immigrated to the greatest little place in the Caribbean, Dominican Republic. That was from memory, by the way. All right. This is clearly time to call an end to this podcast. Thank you very much for listening to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast. If you want to know more about the Claremont Institute, I promise there is no Manuel content on the American Mind. There is some, but only negative, at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com. And you can donate to support our work at claremont.org/donate, which we greatly support. If you donate enough, I'll never mention Lin-Manuel ever again. Don't forget our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Thanks, as always, to our production and engineering crew, the brothers G, Jake, and Ryan Gannon. And thanks to all of you for putting up with our mishigas and for listening. Please don't forget to rate, review, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And we will talk to you next week.